Thanks, Jenny. You can hear okay? I think especially the people in the back. I think they're so far away they're joining by Zoom in the back. But and I'll probably wander around. So again, the people on Zoom, I hope I'm not going to go in and out of camera or something like that. Oh, and I can see that as well. Look at this. Well, before I launch into anything, I just really want to give my congratulations to IRiS, to especially Jenny, launched it, Nando, Anne, who is, you know, like in anything, the administrators are what it's all about. So congratulations to them and the university for 10 years, fantastic. And indeed, I gave the opening talk 10 years ago when the thing was launched, but it never occurred to me to look back on what I actually said in that keynote, because it would be really embarrassing if I say the same things and show that I haven't moved on in 10 years or something. I hope that's not the case. I hope nobody has a record of that. Also, I wanted to say before launching, you know, being the opening speaker, there's a real kind of pressure and obligation. Last week, I was the final speaker at a big conference, and a final speaker, you have to summarize things, you have to keep people awake, you have to bring it all together. And opening speaker, you have to energize people, get everybody kind of focused and excited and stuff like that. And so I don't know which is worse or better. I think I'd probably rather do the opening thing. So I hope what I have to say accomplishes that, to get everybody focused on some of the issues that we'll be talking about the next 3 days, maybe enthused or irate or whatever, they just in the mood of talking about this kind of stuff. Okay, so indeed, Jenny, sorry about that. The title is a bit of a mouthful, but it's what I'm talking about, so no apologies there. And sorry, they don't have a clicker in this high-tech room, so we're kind of old school here. And Palladia, thanks, and again, thanks for all your work putting this together, but we're still making you work even during my talk here. So I'm gonna have to signal her. So this is the outline of the talk. I'll try not to go on too long. Indeed, unabashedly, it is a plug for the book coming out in a couple of months. But it's not only that. I'm not only going to talk about the book. There will be some things I'll be talking about that are not in the book. So in other words, please still read the book. The good news is, I hope there's nobody from Routledge here, but I'll share it with you. It's open access, so you don't have to buy it. But anyways, a lot of things I'll talk about will be in there. So it's only appropriate that I say a few words about, you know, what I now call the superdiversity thing. And then sedge that into what I'm talking about, this conundrums of social categories. And I really hope it interfaces nicely with what Cecilia is going to be talking about, because I know she's hugely interested in social categories. We're probably coming from different ways, but I hope it might neatly fit together. We'll see. And what I think in terms of what these conundrums are, I'll try to explain that. I'll go into stuff about essentialism, which, you know, for some of the maybe more senior scholars, let's put it that way, I hope you're not thinking, oh God, Steve's still talking about essentialism, that's such a 90s thing. I don't know for the younger scholars how much essentialism is still talked about, but I'm gonna make a case that we need, if it's not being talked about, we need to return to this, especially in light of some of the conundrums I'll talk about. And then I'll go on to talk about some other stuff leading into talks generally about social complexity. So let's, instead of talking about what I'm going to talk about, let me talk about it. Next, please. Whoops, other way. There we go. So the superdiversity thing, I hope I don't need to rehearse what the concept and method and approach is all about. Basically, I've always said it's not a theory, it's a descriptive concept to point to things that at the time I wrote that 2007 article, I was seeing in migration data, particularly in the UK, that we were seeing movements of people with very different social categories than the previous 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And so trying to figure out what this means, what's going on with people with more varied categorical backgrounds, but also new intersectionalities with other kinds of categories that we often didn't talk about. We never talked about legal status enough at that time, 15 years ago. interfaces, of course, with gender, age, aspects of human capital. So anyways, I hope you're familiar with the superdiversity thing. It's all about these multiplicities of social categories and how they were meshing in different sorts of ways, different sorts of configurations. Yeah, and now again, and unapologetically, we couldn't do anything about it. These were, of course, state categories I was dealing with. I was dealing with statistics, national official statistics. We'll get into this about state categories and what they're actually doing to the way we perceive and talk about groups and so forth. So anyways, changing combinations of social categories was one of the first big things I was trying to point to with the superdiversity concept. Sorry, Palladia, next one, please. But on top of social categories, I was also trying to point to the fact that these changing social categories, migration was in flux, still is in flux. And not only are the categories meshing different ways, but they're having real effects on what we anthropologists especially talk about in terms of social organization, patterns of stratification, inequality, spatial aspects, new modes of racism, etc., contact. So it was both about changing categories and changing social organization. That's what the superdiversity thing for me was all about. What I was trying to point to is this inherent connection. I mean, it's there within much of social science, but I was trying to point to it in a particular way by way of these changing configurations, that both things were changing. Okay, so it's again pointing to an essential relationship between social categories, and I'll talk more about those in a second, and social organization, that these two things define each other, basically. And I'm saying, hold this thought, because this is basically what the talk is all about, and I'm going to come back to this in different ways throughout the talk. Okay, so what am I talking about in terms of conundrums of social categories? And I don't know how many people here teach sort of introductory sociology, anthropology, and so forth. You're probably familiar with this conundrum that I'm talking about. So the first thing is, on the one side, all of our social theory about social categories has to do with the fact that these are social constructions. Yeah, the groups of any kind, that social categories, even state categories, we ourselves have created these things. They don't occur naturally in nature out there. These are social constructions. And because they're social constructions, they're open to shifting categories, shifting definitions, shifting meanings, and so forth. And that, ever since Friedrich Barth, but going through Michel Lamont and all sorts of people, we've focused as social scientists on the boundaries of categories, what they call the boundary work. And that, as Friedrich Barth famously said, the cultural stuff within the boundary of the category doesn't really matter. All the attention is on how groups manage the boundaries of their social categories. And so things can flux inside, the boundaries can move and shift and so forth. This is all basic social science. This is how we have learned to think about social categories. And that a lot of the sociological stuff going on, the processes going on out there, are the tension between what we can call assignment and assertion. So assignment, Friedrich Barth talked about it as ascription by others. Assignment is what I or we say you are. And assertion is what I say I am. And all of this sociological processes is about these things being contradicted, contested, negotiated, and this is where a lot of social scientific work is at, how people manage assignment versus assertion, social boundaries, flux. So basically, this is one side of the equation that we've come to learn and talk about and teach. Yeah, again, for those of you who teach this stuff, you'll probably recognize this. This is basic to a lot of social theory. On the other side, however, on the one side, as I said, we talk about flux and social construction and all these sorts of things. On the other side, we have to recognize that people are hugely emotionally and cognitively invested in these categories that we otherwise talk about as in flux and social constructed and so forth. what is just an example that has always stuck in my head since the mid-1990s, when the genocide in Rwanda was going on. I remember distinctly reading an anthropologist, I think it might have been in New York Times, something like that, an anthropologist saying, with these categories, Hutu and Tutsi, they're just social constructions. They don't really exist. They're epiphenomenal. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people were being massacred because of these social constructions. And we've done a failure to link how people are willing to kill and die for these social constructions and loose boundaries and fluidity and stuff like that. So this is what I'm meaning as part of the conundrum, how we can both recognize this fluidity and the work going on and social stuff and the deep meaning that these social constructions have for people. Not only people socially, but people personally as well. There's a lot of identity work going on. People sorting out their own categories and what they mean to themselves and choosing new categories and morphing into new categories and so forth. And this has to be tied together as well. And then likewise, we have to recognize that even though these things are fluid and socially constructed, they have real world consequences, obviously, in terms of patterns of inequality, discrimination, violence, and so forth. So this is what I'm meaning by this, conundrum. How we spend half our time teaching about these things in flux and half our time talking about how deeply invested people are in these categories. The social malleable side and the socially lived side of social categories. Okay, next please. Now, both, one thing connecting both, and I don't want to get too, cognitive psychology sort of stuff, but if we talk about the thing linking both of these things is social categories provide people with a way of seeing the world. Okay, it's something happening inside people's heads that helps sort out. Next, please. And what I mean by that is, for instance, Michel Lamont has talked about these classification systems of social categories help people perceive and make sense of their worlds. Obviously, people need to know, we are categorizing, classifying creatures. That's what our brains do. And we do that to social groups as well. So social categories help people perceive and make sense of the world. Richard Jenkins talks about how they enable people to have some sort of expectation of what to expect from a stranger or something. Yeah. So there's cognitive leading on to emotional, etc. work that social categories are doing. And then Patrick Simon and others have talked about, this goes for these official and indeed scientific statistical categorizations, the things that we play with all the time. We are part of this social construction of reality, of social reality, because we participate in and reproduce these official categories, which divide up the world into groups. But again, people also invest these with emotions and identities and so forth. Okay, so there's this thing of social categories providing a way of seeing the world. And again, with some of the repercussions, yeah, they're constant. These sort of categories are constantly being reproduced in media, in politics, political discourse, in law, especially in institutions. You just look around us all the time, and key social categories are constantly being reproduced all the time. Yeah, and I'll come to the point, of course, they're being challenged as well. That comes later in the talk. Yeah, but nevertheless, here's this link again with social organization, that these social categories have real effects on social interaction, real effects on differential treatment and inequalities, on rights, and so forth, okay? Now, this is where I start to go into the essentialisms thing. And hopefully, yeah, the younger scholars will be familiar enough with this idea of essentialisms. I talk about the fact that, these categories are being reproduced constantly all around us in academia, but especially in media and the public sphere and so forth. And all too often, the ways that social categories are being perpetually reproduced are by way of what I call a family of essentialisms. So next, please. So you might be familiar with these terms in one way or another, and I'll go through some of the authors that talk about these, give a quick explanation, because I think we need to be reminded of what's going on. Because, as I say, these sorts of social categorizations are at the heart of so much discrimination and inequality right now. And don't worry, I'll come back to the superdiversity thing and how they relate too. So what I call these things a family of essentialisms. And I'll just go through a quick definition of each one of these. Where's my watch? And my contention is that if you are prone to categorize your world by way of any one of these, you're probably doing it by all 5 of them as well. It's just a way of seeing the world, and I hope you'll see what I mean, and will buy what I'm trying to sell here. Okay. So the first one people might know, Rogers Brubaker some years ago famously talked about groupism, this tendency to assume that the world is, the social world is comprised of discrete, sharply differentiated, internal homogeneous, and externally bounded groups. It's just a basic assumption that that's how the world works, how the social world works. And of course, he and many other social scientists, again, point to the fact that, well, this is all socially constructed stuff, but it comes to be, again, the way we perceive the world. And just so many people assume that our social categories are natural phenomena. And it just drives me crazy. We can happy to have this conversation later on. You know, so many evolutionary psychologists and others, you know, especially post-Trump and Brexit and all this stuff, you know, this idea of tribalism. And you get these people swanning in and writing op-eds talking about, well, tribalism and all of this is just natural. It's built into who we are. It's how the human race has survived by way of us being tribal. And I don't buy any of it. And we can go into reasons why. But it's just part of this idea of groupism, this assumption that social groups are a natural part of the world. And it leads to this idea also of what I call zero-sum groupism, that if your group gets something, housing, special tax breaks, special jobs or something like that, then necessarily my group has to suffer because there's only so much to go around. And it's behind a lot of xenophobia and racism right now, is this zero-sum groupism. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, I don't want to spend too long on any one of these. Next, please. So linked up with this is what Amartya Sen calls singular affiliation, that not only for a lot of people does the world seem naturally divided into groups, but that depending on any sort of category, you can only belong to one group. And it's not up to you. You are allotted to different groups. And again, people just think that's the natural part of the world. And he calls this singular affiliation. Okay, and this is opposed to certain forms of multiplicity that I'll get on towards the end of the talk. Now, next, please. Culturalism. A lot of people have written about this, but Verena Stolke was one of the first to really lay it on the line. It's taking culture as this kind of natural bounded unit. Rather than, you know, in an anthropological sense, culture is a kind of open-ended, amorphous set of values and practices and categories also. But somehow through culturalization, we assume that culture has a boundary to it. People belong to a culture, and all these values and practices are shared homogeneously within the boundaries of that group. That's what she talks about as culturalism. And this is another key mode of essentializing people, of assuming things about their cultural practices because they belong to a particular group. Racialization is another crucial one. There's a really recent article by Loic Wacant. Racialization, there's a lot of literature on racialization. You probably know a lot more beyond this, but I thought he encapsulates it quite nicely. It's this idea of kind of biologizing everything we're talking about, group boundedness, culture, singular affiliation. To think that this is somehow grounded in biology, that people's traits are eternal and unchanging, and that, again, everybody who belongs to a particular group homogeneously shares the same traits, okay? So the key part of racialization as one of this family of essentialisms I'm talking about. Sorry, Palladia, you're trying to write at the same time as doing this. And finally, I don't think he particularly put it this way, but Jan Blommaert was one of the key people. I think Ben is here as well. Ben Rampton worked closely with Jan and a number of other sociolinguists. Talked in the same sort of way. Out there is this view that language is also contained by a kind of boundary, and everybody has certain linguistic practices and attributes within a bounded whole, and outside of that is different. And Jan and Ben and other colleagues argue against this, and they show through really excellent empirical work that that's not how language works. But again, in people's heads, that's how they think language works, that we have linguistic groups which are like ethnic groups, or like other bounded social groups that have hard and fast social boundaries. Okay, so again, thanks. So all of these fit together, and I think hopefully you see what I mean, that if you tend to divide the world and think of the world through any one of these, there's a good chance you think through all of these things. And again, next please. This is all, it's a way of seeing the world, but it's constantly, these sorts of essentialisms are constantly being reproduced in what I call the representational field out there. The way people talk, the way media deals with stuff, the way politicians talk, the way laws are made. They're constantly bearing down on and reproducing these kinds of essentialisms out there. And this is another kind of conundrum of social categories. So what to do about essentialism? And I say, going back to the 90s and, showing my age, what can I do about it unapologetically? There have been a lot of key social scientific concepts that have basically been part of the weaponry that has been called anti-essentialism, that tries to push back scientifically against these kinds of essentialisms. And hopefully, people will recognize all, if not most of these terms. I would say, since the 1990s, these are some of the most important breakthrough concepts in our field. And they all have to do with challenging the idea of fixed categories, fixed bounded categories. Okay, they're all anti-essentialist in one mode or another. And you see that I stick superdiversity at the end. Because I kind of lived through this great age of anti-essentialism, I have been certainly influenced by all of these key terms. And just, again, maybe for the younger scholars, if you don't know any of these terms, I would say bone up on them because they're all really important to our field. Okay, and by the way, I could make this these slides available to anybody who wants them, or maybe I'll leave them with Palladia as well. So in social science, there has been all sorts of attempts to push back against this family of essentialisms. But I would say right now, and this is where I'm morphing into the part of the talk about social complexity, is better watch. Keep on my watch here. Okay, yeah, perfect. Halfway through. In addition to social scientists pushing back against these idea of fixed, bounded, essentialist notions of social categories, there are processes going on right now out there that are themselves looking to push back against these things. We're in an age right now where that's happening, transforming, and I put the trans in there in italics because, Claudia, please. Because right now we're in an age where transnational, transgender, transsexual, transracial, translanguaging are key terms out there. Okay, translanguaging is still maybe within the realm of sociolinguistics and anthropological linguistics, but we have all sorts of social movements, especially devoted to transsexuality, transracialism, transgender. Okay, and those who don't know it, Rogers Brubaker has a really interesting book just called Trans, where he talks about these things. Now he suggests we're in an age of unsettled identities. And that's right, but I think it's unsettled identities sounds like it's just kind of happening out there. And I think it's important to know that there are people out there, there are social movements actively contesting the fixity of social categories. It's not just happening out there. There's a whole set of identity movements going out there looking to turn over some of these essentialist categories. So I would say that we're in an era of unprecedented multiplying of categories, making and unmaking of categories, and mixing of categories, I think as never before. And I hope you're seeing how this kind of relates to the social diversity thing, the superdiversity thing that we're talking about as well. All of these things changing fixity and boundaries. Next, please. So just one example. I don't know if people saw in the US, there was quite a bit of attention around the last census results. And one of the big kind of issues or big takeaways from the last US census was the massive rise in the number of people identifying themselves as mixed. Yeah, 276% increase between just 2 census periods. And so, the New York Times, as well as lots of, academic commentators were asking, well, why did that happen? How could suddenly so many people appear on the census as mixed? And, is it because actually more multiracial babies were born? Were people just rethinking their identities, or does it have to do with changes on the form? Because in the last US Census, again, Cecilia will probably, certainly know more about this. Not only were you able to tick lots of boxes, but you could also write in. You could tick multiple boxes and write in a sub ethnicity if you wanted. And so suddenly these categories were exploding all over the place. And, the conclusion was, well, yes, it's all of the above. More so-called multiracial babies were being born. Americans were rethinking identities, and the census form was changed because they knew people wanted to express themselves in much more multiple and mixed ways. Yeah, or the way the economist put it is the way that people see themselves is changing. This is what I'm saying is not only academics trying to talk about anti-essentialism, that across the public, people are trying to fight back against hard and fixed categories. Yeah. Now, of course, there are people fighting back against the anti-essentialist, if we want to call it that, or the social movements out there looking to overturn fixed categories in the name of trans, X, Y, or Z, transgender, transsex, racialism. And there's all sorts of pushback going on right now. And for me, that's part of the social complexity going on, this contestation of categories. Some people wanting to push back, people rushing in and trying to fix gender categories, fix sexual identities, fix languages, et cetera, across the board, yeah? So this is all part of an emergent social complexity. Yeah, things happening on both sides, trying to undo social categories and trying to redo or fix social categories. Next, please. Okay, so as I say, it's all part of what I talk about. I get into this in the book, but I write elsewhere as well, about thinking about what does social complexity mean. And traditionally in my discipline in anthropology, but also in archaeology, there's a long literature on complexity and social complexity. And at Oxford, I used to teach a postgraduate course on anthropology of cultural complexity. I think Susanna, you might have been in that course. But traditionally, it's mainly been about just social organization. Social complexity was a thing about social organization, about population size, economic base, specialization, land use, etc. Next, please. And it was always linked to a highly kind of evolutionary model. Complexity was something that you talked about in an evolutionary way, from tribes and all this through kingdoms and empires and all that. And in the archaeological literature, there's still a lot of that way of talking about social complexity. But what I'm trying to make a case for, and I go into this in the book a bit, please, is it's, again, not just about social organization. This is where I'm bringing back in this thing about social categories as well. Social complexity is organization and the social categories and how they impact each other. And here I'm hugely influenced by, I'm lucky to say, two friends of mine and a guy who I respect, Barth, Hannert, and Erickson. And they talk about complexity as something to do with meaning and with categories. When you have in a population meanings differentially spread throughout the population. Okay, it depends on your social position, what meanings you have, what categories you hold, what categories you place upon the world, the unequal distribution of meanings and categories. But that's a crucial part of social complexity, as well as all the social organization stuff, or class and occupational specialization and hierarchies and all that kind of stuff. So it's, again, both of these things together forms what I'm talking about as these changing configurations of social complexity. And this is where I also fit in this stuff, what I say about the kind of right-wing xenophobic pushback, that they are part of the uneven distribution of meaning in society. So social complexity is combining both of these things. Again, just like I talked about with the original superdiversity thing. It's both about categories and about social organization. And together, these things, and I find this a really useful concept that's really been talked about by McCall and Walby, mostly after I came up with the superdiversity thing. They talk about the need to understand complex inequalities. Inequalities that, they start with, as it were, kind of classic intersectionality theory, but then they add complexity to it. They say it's not just about key intersectional categories of race, gender, and class, but a myriad number of categories on top of that. The kind of stuff that I was trying to point to with superdiversity as well. They say it's multiple intersections of these sorts that are creating complex inequalities out there. And we have to be able to get our heads around that in one way or another. Okay, so this is going to really complicate an already complicated story, but this is where I've been devoting some work recently, because I've been hanging out maybe too much for my own good with social psychologists. But I've really been influenced also by what's called social identity complexity theory. I don't know how many people are au fait with that. Also talked about as multiple social categorization. This is work started maybe 15 years or so ago by Rokas and Brewer. And we've all known a long time, and the social scientific literature is replete with recognition that we all have situational identities, multiple identities, role-based identities, identities that shift between home and public sphere and private sphere and all of this. But they sort of instrumentalized this and took a deeper look at how people conceptualize their own multiple social categories. And they found a couple of really interesting things that first of all, people vary significantly in how aware and cognizant they are of their own multiple social categories. And the people who are most aware of the non-overlapping nature of their social categories have different social attitudes towards others. And I think this is important stuff, because you could actually turn this into some sort of social program. So basically, one example they use is, for instance, if you take an Italian Catholic woman, they say, and some Italian Catholic women, mostly their social network is comprised of other Italian Catholic women, and they sort of perceive that as their sphere, as their social category. But some realize that not all Italians are Catholic, not all Italians are women, not all women are Italian, not all women are Catholic, etc. You see what I mean? The discreteness of each category, that you overlap with a lot of people who don't share all three categories. If that makes sense, people who are more aware of the non-discrete overlapping categories they have are able to see the social complexity of others more. And the more that people recognize are able to recognize social complexity in others and don't see people just in terms of essentialized categories where it's all lumped together, those people have far more positive social attitudes and social behaviors. You know, all these ways that social psychologists talk about these things. And there's a massive amount of experimental literature that shows this. And even though I'm an anthropologist, I'm convinced by this stuff, and I think it's important. And so we have to recognize, how can we link these things up? Yeah. Complexity of social organization, complexity of social categories, and individual complexity of selves. Yeah, so next. So first of all, for me, this helps me a bit with this conundrum. Remember, I talked about the conundrum between this idea that categories are constantly social malleable, but they're socially lived. The idea of social identity complexity helps me through that. It's the social malleable side that you know, that these things are flexible, but people are able to be cognizant of their own flexibility and malleability and control over their own identities, and can be given nudges to do so. And they're socially lived, social categories are indeed socially lived, but people with so-called high social identity complexity are able to appreciate the fact that their social categories are just facets of themselves. They are not totalizing categories. They're not these essentializing categories. People essentialize themselves all the time, of course. And people with high social identity complexity are able to cut through that. So, just saying, you can look up some of these things. There's some fantastic recent work in this field. One, a meta-analysis of 40 years of studies on social complexity, social identity complexity, and so forth. And it shows that, the way they put it, even if individuals are cognitively disposed to think categorically about social groups, i.e., if, because we're swimming in this representational field that's constantly telling us about essentialized categories, that family of essentialisms, that nevertheless people are quite capable of putting that aside and being able to think in more complex terms about identities. So this is just shown in a meta review of hundreds of studies. And then this recent study in PNAS, a massive database of people, and I find this really interesting because a lot of the in the Superdiversity book that's coming out, I talk about diversification processes, and they show that in places which are rapidly diversifying across a number of social categories, that just that process itself, just exposure to more and more categorical diversity, actually prompts or triggers this more complex view, and people that exaggerated stereotypes and this essentialist thinking itself gets chipped away at. Just the more people are exposed to increasing levels of diversity, or dare I say superdiversity as well. So this, you know, a study like this in PNAS is something that I think you have to take seriously on board. Okay. Again, you know, it's a way of seeing the world, but what we've got going against us is this representational field again. I just keep coming back to this. We are swimming in a sea of essentialist ideas about social categories and groups. So what we need is a new social imaginary. I would say we need to help, as academics, help. My idea, late in the career, I can say these sorts of things. We need to help usher in a new social imaginary that's non-essentialist in these ways, that is more complex. And you know, I use social imaginary very much after Charles Taylor. It's how people think society works, okay? As a shared social imaginary that you imbibe in all sorts of different ways, from school, from your family, from your mates, from reading the newspaper, from watching movies, etc. You think society works in a particular way. And this changes over time. So next, please. And I would say, you know, and this is the thing I've been beating throughout the whole talk here, I'm just coming to the end, that so much of our shared social imaginary right now, especially in the global north, is premised on this family of essentialisms, okay, constantly being reproduced. And that, you know, this goes back to my original impetus for coming up with the superdiversity things, trying to come full circle back. So we're talking about superdiversity still. My whole impetus for doing this is my dissatisfaction with the social imaginary of multiculturalism. I wrote about that in the original article. I've written many times since. Even before the superdiversity article, I was writing critical articles about multiculturalism. Because of course, you know, in a broad sense, you know, I want to be pro-multicultural. But the way, both in academic literature, but especially in public discourse, the way multiculturalism was talked about and in many places is still continued to be talked about, is still very much packed around at least one of, if not more, of this family of essentialisms. And I know that, you know, there are a lot of academics who still write about this. I don't know if there's anybody here from Bristol, you know, the so-called Bristol School of Multiculturalism. And they are constantly trying to say that, no, we talk about multiculturalism in non-essentialist ways, and we're not, you know, trying to reproduce any of these fixed categories. That may be the case in what they're writing. But when you come across multiculturalism as uttered by a politician or in the media, it's basically sounds to me like it's based on one of these forms of groupist, racialized, culturalized discourses, yeah? And so the superdiversity thing was my kind of challenge to the idea of multiculturalism. Because again, superdiversity was about shifting categories of new intersectionalities and so forth. And that stuff just wasn't covered in the idea of multiculturalism and the way it was talked about. And I talked about it as a social imaginary of multiculturalism because it permeated law and public discourse and politics and so forth. Okay. Next, please. And so this is last slide. What I'm talking about as a call for a new social imaginary, we have to somehow help usher in these ideas of complexity. And again, in a nutshell, for me, complexity has to do with multiple categories, with multiple causalities, with multiple processes, and with multiple outcomes. That, you know, that's echoes complexity is used in complexity sciences, and we need to usher it into social sciences. All too often, you know, and I was just in this meeting all last week with politicians and whatnot, politicians and policymakers don't want complexity. They want reduction and simplification because they've got to deliver. And it's our jobs as academics to say, no, we need to get people thinking about what complexity looks like in social organization, and this idea of complex inequalities. What complex, multiple, mixed, and changing social categories looks like, and what complex individual identities look like by way of social identity complexity theory. And all of these things are linked. And this is the next challenge, I think, for social theory, is to be able to link the complexities of each one of these things, to think social complexity. Because again, I wholly believe, and again, this, you know, from being inundated in this social identity complexity literature, social relationships can and will be improved through more complex approaches to social categories, and complex inequalities, if not ameliorated, can at least be better understood and perceived if we're looking for complexity in how inequality actually works. So that's my take-home message. It's not a simple one. It shouldn't be. It should be complex. And you know, I've been quoting all of these serious and heavy and big social theorists at you the whole time. So I'll end with something a little bit lighter, but nevertheless with a sentiment that I wholly believe. And I hope you believe this message too, and that our social scientific endeavors can help bring about the Palin-esque approach to the world. Okay, thanks everybody.